really delighted to be here. Thanks to Ahmed and Ishaq for including me, and to the ERF in this really, truly exciting project that I think hits on some of the most important questions that the region certainly is facing now and has been facing for a long time. So I want to make some comments about private sector development briefly in the region, and then largely focus on some more general sort of theoretical points that I think will be quite complementary with the remarks that have been made already this morning to think about the way the depictions of the market and the private sector in theorizing about the politics of development. And I'm also, I should say, really delighted as a political scientist that that politics are central here. At a minimum, my job is not in threat, so that's good. Except, of course, if the economists entirely take over political science, then I'm really in trouble. Okay, so I think actually what's interesting to me now, and quite a contrast to these conversations that are happening over dinner parties in Cairo, is that among academics who study development, I think there's now a fair amount of acceptance of the importance of the role of the private sector. We don't quite see as many polarized debates about whether it's the market that should drive development or the state. There really has been a kind of convergence that state-led development has some inbuilt limitations. That does not mean there's no disagreements. There's still a lot of room for disagreement on the precise role of the government in the economy. But the notion that the private sector is a critical actor in driving development, I think, is accepted across a wide array of ideological orientations now. And so in this context, it's really important to think about the role of the private sector in development in the Middle East, which in many places is really facing a crisis situation. I'm thinking of a figure in one of the earlier chapters in a book that Ishaq and I published last year called A Political Economy of the Middle East. And in this figure, there's public spending as a percentage of GDP contrasted with private sector spending as a percentage of GDP. And when you look at the public sector line, trend line over time, it's a downward progression over time. And this is an average for developing countries in the Middle East. But the private sector line does not actually go up to compensate for the decline in the public sector spending. So it's a big problem. You have this steady decline from the early 1980s in public sector spending, but a relatively flat line in private sector spending as a percentage of GDP. So this is clearly a major problem facing the region. There's some interesting variation within the region, of course, and I think that's a subject of a whole other discussion. But in general, this is the trend that we see. And it's a trend that's all the more urgent in the wake of the Arab uprisings, which of course shined a light on the fact that governments across the region are not delivering for the majority of the population and have not been driving sustainable and inclusive development. The uprisings exposed something that political scientists have known since the 1990s, which is that networks of privilege are really what drive access to economic opportunities and are a critical part of the economic landscape in this region. And I should emphasize that this is true the world over, but there are, of course, important qualitative differences in the way these networks of privilege function and the kinds of effects that they have on economic growth and development and so forth. So now it's really, I think, conventional wisdom for specialists on the Middle East and North Africa that the marketization trend was something that occurred without competition. So it was the construction of markets, in general, in the context of a lack of competition for access to opportunities that get generated with economic liberalization. And we know, of course, that the private sector needs to play a dynamic role in driving development, and that's the sort of punchline of that figure in the book that I mentioned. So what I find it really exciting that the political economy of the private sector is front and center on the research agenda again, and that's what this conference is all about, and that it's a subject of debate once again among specialists. But what's interesting now is it seems to be a subject of conversation not just in narrow academic or policy circles, but the world over. I mean, Occupy is fundamentally all about this. And so this is something that ordinary people and not just academics and policymakers are thinking about as well. So let me say a few abstract things, actually building on some comments that Ishat just made about images of the private sector in development, and then take us into a discussion of how this applies to this region and this conference. So when we take a step back, there are a variety of overarching narratives describing the role of the private sector in development and more generally presenting sort of ideal typical models of state-business relations. And the first paradigm I'm thinking of is exactly the one that Ishat just mentioned, the sort of triumphalist narrative of that's really at the core of modernization theory. And the second is a more critical narrative on the other side of the spectrum that looks at state-business relations as one that are fundamentally characterized by rent extraction, by the politics of rent extraction, that have really deleterious economic consequences and can condemn countries into a sort of development trap that does not enable them to break out of middle-income status. And this can play out at various levels. It can play out in the realm of state-business relations that we're talking about here. It has implications for society. It also has implications for the way that the global economy comes into play. So looking first at the realm of state-business relations, this is where we see a kind of virtuous circle in the modernization paradigm between state institutions and market institutions. So the opening of markets then in this paradigm, in this sort of positive paradigm, is accompanied by some kind of limited, at least, if not more extensive, political opening, in the extreme democratization. And this leads to a kind of self-reinforcing dynamic, a process of positive returns that culminates in a set of capitalist institutions being constructed and maintaining growth and development. So capable state institutions somehow are presumed to exist, but they're not really theorized in this modernization paradigm. And they exist really just to provide baseline legal and regulatory underpinnings for markets to operate efficiently. And so in this paradigm, policymakers just somehow, provide supportive industrial policy. They promote business development. They provide incentives to foster industrial upgrading and now service sector upgrading, so that more value added can be captured in the domestic economy. And they, of course, encourage more integration in the global economy. And in global production chains. So that's sort of the virtuous circle at the core of the modernization paradigm. Meanwhile, you have on, somewhat the other end of the spectrum, this kind of middle-income trap depiction of state-business relations that really looks at, and this is where the politics come into play front and center, the ways that pre-existing crony relations and rent-seeking networks that span the public and private sectors basically capture the process of economic opening, of creating markets. And so when you create markets, these networks are deployed in order to derive rent-extracting opportunities and so forth. So what you get is a kind of negative returns process And so that whatever spoils are created from the construction of markets, from economic liberalization, are not able to be deployed in a more sustainable way. And so access to credit, finance, even the access to economic opportunities, investment opportunities are inherently politicized, and these kind of rent-sharing arrangements get consolidated in ruling coalitions to the exclusion of opposing groups, and so forth. And it becomes extremely difficult to break out of this self-reinforcing cycle absent some kind of real social revolution. So speaking of social revolutions, what are the implications on the societal level for these two different kinds of paradigms of state-business relations? So of course, for the modernization paradigm, you get a kind of rosy picture in which a relatively inclusive form of rule emerges that provides broad-based economic opportunities for members of society. So there's a formal sector where most employment is located, and that provides economic security and opportunities for social mobility. There's middle-class pressure for more rule-based transactions, so you get a tendency for transparency and the rule of law to emerge. And this, of course, provides those critical assurances to investors domestically and abroad to invest in the economy, and you have a state that guarantees individual rights and provides the basic institutions for markets to function while civil society organizations operate and exist, generally along sort of occupational lines, not so much along identity-based lines as in the name of political Islam or ethnicity or whatever it might be. So when you look at this other paradigm of the rent extracting kind of middle income trap paradigm, you get a very different picture of what politics looks like in society. And a number of dynamics ensue that are potentially quite destabilizing. So of course, rising inequality is at the center of the rent extraction paradigm, where you have the 1% or even the 0.1%, it seems, having disproportionate access to opportunities, which by its very nature is exclusionary. You have thwarted middle-class aspirations, a lack of that transparency that emerges from middle-class mobilization, limited opportunities for formal sector employment and therefore exclusion of a lot of the population, in a resort on the part of ruling authorities to increasing repression, political restrictions to contain dissent by the excluded, and perhaps even mass mobilization that can occur in some cases along identity-based lines. So quite different pictures of the dynamics, of social dynamics in these different paradigms of state-business relations. On the global scene, these contrasting narratives are reflected in the discourses and orientations of development agencies, of international donors, and Isha has already referred to the Washington Consensus, which of course, is at the core. It really kind of reflects or encapsulates some of these modernization notions, and was, I would say, rather dominant, even in some sort of tempered forms with the second version of the Washington Consensus until the more recent financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And a lot of things were backing this up, the so-called third wave of democratization, in which you had a trend towards political liberalization in much of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in East Asia, not so much in the Middle East and North Africa. And this was certainly reflected in development policy and discourse, notably in the kinds of policies you see in the Washington Consensus, including the sort of Washington Consensus II, where there was more attention to targeted poverty alleviation schemes and investment in public infrastructure and so forth. And the importance of state capacity, that you have to have capable state institutions, was more and more accepted in development discourse. But this notion of capable state institutions was much more treated as a kind of technical policy fix rather than something that involved politics. So how do you get regulatory institutions that are capable of regulating markets effectively? How do you get effective fiscal bureaucracies and so forth? Much more treated as technical policy fixes rather than political problems that are, political to their core and therefore a little bit more difficult to disentangle. And I think by now we've realized that that's obviously not the world we're living in, and it's not just academics that realize this, it's many, many other people, it's policymakers. In fact, recently I was on a panel discussing a World Bank report called Making Politics Work for Development. So I think it's become increasingly mainstream that politics are at the core of development challenges. And it's not just a bunch of political scientists and sociologists sitting around thinking about these things anymore. Since 2007, it's really kind of hard to ignore at this point that we're not living in this world of a virtuous circle between states and markets, and that capable state institutions don't emerge necessarily out of these virtuous circles and so forth. We've seen, of course, massive decline in trade and output and decline in commodity prices that were fueling many countries, particularly in the developing world. Inequality is now, of course, at the center in the spotlight in conversations among economists, in conversations among political scientists, but not just there. Obviously, inequality is a topic in society more broadly and is at the center of social movements across the world. And interestingly, is something that's considered to be harmful by Wall Street. I mean, the place where inequality resides most obviously, in terms of the location of the 0.1%, it is now conventional wisdom on Wall Street that this kind of extreme inequality is actually deleterious to long-term growth prospects. So it's interesting that there is this convergence. It doesn't mean that we all come up with the same solution for how to deal with it, but there is this convergence in understanding that this is a trend and that is potentially harmful economically and socially. We see, employment hollowing out in advanced industrialized countries in the sense that you can't, the sort of middle class dream of upward mobility through, factory jobs and so forth is really out of reach for most people. And I think that's obviously at the core of the recent election that just took place in my country, but also elsewhere as well. And I think the global economic context is quite different. We can't ignore this in shaping the prospects for development for middle-income countries. So we are not living in the world that the East Asian, high-performing economies lived in the 60s and 70s, where it was possible to export your way into high growth, right? And where there were global markets that could import your products. And right now we're living in a world in which China has really dominated manufacturing and to some degree has closed off that route to industrial development for many, many countries. And so you don't have that kind of employment-based industrialization model for development on the table the way it was in previous decades for many countries. I think we're still on the cusp of thinking about what it means to develop through service-based economies, and certainly intellectual capital is really critical more and more for development, but it's unevenly distributed across the globe, so we have a trend towards kind of economic nationalism or mercantilist policies in some ways in the advanced industrialized countries in this global economic context that, of course, has implications for middle-income countries and their prospects for development. So what do these different narratives that we're talking about do for us? I mean, they're obviously ideal, typical models here. They're not pure encapsulated reflections of reality, and neither one 100% captures what's going on in any given place. And you know, to understand what's going on in a particular context, you need to not only look at this global economic setting that shapes development, but also at the nature of politics, at the nature of political arrangements particularly between ruling elites and private sector elites to understand the kinds of development paths that different countries undertake and what their implications are for growth and development. So the question is, you know, under what conditions does one dynamic, do these sort of more virtuous types of self-reinforcing dynamics kick in? Under what conditions do you get these more kind of rent-seeking dynamics kick in that inhibit growth and development? And this conference, I think, moves us closer to understanding that, to getting some answers to these questions by looking at state business relations in particular places, but collectively enabling us to do some cross-national comparisons. And by tracing the evolution or reinforcement of existing patterns of state business relations in different economic moments. And I think what's exciting is that this work really builds on and advances quite substantially an earlier wave of scholarship on state business relations in this part of the world, to which I contributed myself, many others more extensively. And I was thinking back to an edited volume that Stephen Heidemann from Smith College wrote back in 2004. I think we were just talking about this yesterday over lunch. And Steve Heidemann wrote back then, thinking about the trend towards economic liberalization in the Middle East and North Africa. The volume's focused on the Middle East and North Africa. He wrote, "Economic reform and rents go hand in hand. And reform programs have either reproduced or created new arrangements that give a privileged few unequal access to the benefits of new economic policies." So this is really at the core of the kinds of questions that are being explored here in more detail. And what's new in the approach of the papers here today is that you get very close attention to empirical detail, in part thanks to the availability of more data since the uprisings, and in part because of different methodological approaches. You have in many of these papers tracing precise mechanisms through which privileges are created and replicated or locked in. And what I think is particularly interesting is the effort to measure the costs of privileges. And so I teach courses on Middle East politics at Harvard, and we just finished the semester, and one of the closing sessions was on the politics of economic development in the region and prospects for the future, and we read a selection from a World Bank report that I think Mark Schiffbauer was a co-author on, in which, you know, the students were invited to read, you know, it's not just that these crony capitalist arrangements exist, but they also have long-term consequences for real people and for development prospects. So it's not just sort of an analytical exercise in mapping connections, but also in understanding their consequences in a path-dependent way going forward for moving countries out of middle-income traps and so forth. And all of these papers really underscore the importance of a political economy lens in understanding development prospects. When we think about privileges, this is really fundamentally a political question, so you cannot understand the dynamics of development and prospects for development without attention to the political economy of economic networks and so forth. So it is widely accepted. I mean, political economy now is a sort of widely accepted way of studying development in the academy, for sure. I think now increasingly in policy circles. And it's become almost axiomatic that you need supportive institutions in order to drive development, right? So these may be conceived in relatively narrow terms, like the work of Douglas North and others, as property rights that guarantee investors against expropriation, or they can be conceived more broadly in terms of capable state institutions such as regulatory capacity, extraction, fiscal capacity, the capacity to incentivize investors to pursue opportunities in potentially high growth sectors and so forth. So there's a variety of ways that states can step in and provide supportive policies and institutions for development. Because, and this is, very widely accepted to be critical for development at a minimum to provide guarantees against expropriation, to provide political stability, to provide the basic public goods that investors need in order to develop, whether it's roads, whether it's, functioning electricity systems and so forth. But what's interesting in some of the recent work, and actually in some older work as well, is that all of this doesn't necessarily need to come through formal rules. So some of it is encapsulated in formal rules against, that establish property rights and so forth. But some of it is encapsulated in kind of informal relations between the state and between business actors. And so when we think of this state-business relationship, we think of the kinds of interests that ruling elites have and that business actors have, and how in pursuing these interests, different kinds of informal arrangements are hammered out that enable investment to occur. So, when we think of the state, government actors generally want things like, holding on to power, for example, and preserving their interests, and in some cases we might even see very sort of forward-thinking government actors actually having an interest in growth because they know this is more stabilizing in the long term for their rule and so forth. Businesses, in some respects, want privileges of various sorts. They want procurement on favorable terms. They want regulations that are conducive to their investment interests. They want access to land, to loans, to subsidies, to monopoly rights, these sorts of things. So there's a variety of interests at the core of state-business relations that get hammered out and are sort of crystallized in what some people have referred to as political settlements. And so this is where the politics is really at the core of development trajectories. So what are these political settlements and what do they do? How do they shape the very kinds of questions at the core of these papers? Political settlements refer in broad terms to the relative distribution of power among different groups and organizations that contest the distribution of resources. So who are these groups and organizations? They're political elites, they're business elites, and other actors in society and the economy. And generally, political settlements are sort of informal arrangements. They're not formal rules that are set out in constitutions and in documents that are filed in ministries and so forth. There are more kinds of informal arrangements at the core of state-business relations that set up these arrangements of privileged access to opportunities and create a kind of stability and predictability that enable investors to operate, but through a set of informal rules again. Now, what's interesting is that and I think this is what really drives differences in development trajectories is that political settlements look different from place to place. So they can be more narrow with a smaller portion of the business elite incorporated in them, and therefore more exclusionary, so more people are excluded from the deals, from the arrangements in the political settlement. And this has implications for politics because those kinds of narrow political settlements ultimately can be quite destabilizing. When you have more and more people that are excluded, they might invite ruling elites to increasingly resort to repression to contain dissent from those who are excluded, or they can be more expansive kinds of political settlements in which broader components of the private sector are included, and even perhaps broader components of society, whether it's labor or whatever it might be. And those might be more growth enhancing in the long term, particularly if there's, a more competitive, merit-based access to economic opportunities. But that's risky from a ruling elite perspective because it means that you have less control over who gets access to opportunities. So there's trade-offs at the heart of these political settlements that have implications for the way investment might proceed, but also for the ways that rulers view their long-term prospects for holding on to power. And so this kind of variation in the informal arrangements, in the political settlements, is really critical to understanding why we see different patterns of state-business relations and why we might see different prospects for economic growth going forward, and perhaps even why we see different patterns of political opening and tolerance in different places. And political settlements are effectively at the core of many of the papers in this meeting here, whether they're explicitly theorized or implicitly contained in them. Political settlements are really at the core of the kinds of arrangements that are analyzed in the political economy of the private sector. So this points to a series of questions that collectively these papers tackle. Namely, what are the mechanisms through which privileges are granted and perpetuated? There are, in some of the papers, we get a view at causality. So do privileges actually enable businesses to succeed? Does granting privileged access to economic opportunities actually facilitate business development or and enable firms to outperform others? Or is it the firms that are, successful to begin with that get access to privileges? Or, what's the driver here? And I think really most exciting for me is, what are the implications? What are the costs and possibly even the benefits of privileges? What are the effects on growth, employment, productivity, and so forth? And this is something that I can say as someone who worked in this earlier wave of research on state-business relations in the Middle East that we really did not tackle. We really did not know, we had a sort of sense that this was not good in a lot of places, but we really didn't know in any systematic way what the implications were for growth, for development, and so forth. And I think I just want to make, I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to make a few sort of comments about the politics of cronyism, not specifically just in this region, but in a cross-regional comparative perspective, because I think these papers and the larger project that they are contributing to raise some really fascinating critical questions about the politics of cronyism and the consequences of cronyism more globally. And so first of all, does corruption, a word that is often used to describe cronyism, always lead to inferior outcomes? And put differently, I think we can pose the question of under what privileges, under what conditions do privileges lead to inferior outcomes? Are there scenarios under which this kind of privileged access to economic opportunities actually is not deleterious to economic growth and development. And broadly speaking, when you look at the conclusions of a lot of these papers, you think, actually, it doesn't look so good in the Middle East and North Africa, that privileged access to economic opportunities has not been a driver of growth and development in this region. Except perhaps in some countries, the picture looks a bit different in the Gulf than in other parts of the region. And this invites the obvious comparison to East Asia. I used to teach a class called The Political Economy of Development, in which I spent virtually no time talking about the Middle East and North Africa, and I spent almost all of my time talking about South Korea, Taiwan, and various Latin American countries. And the most obvious comparison here is to the East Asian countries, and I'm thinking of South Korea in particular. And so there's just enormous quantities of work on East Asian economic development and, the high-performing economies, which reached ridiculous 10% annual growth rates at one point. And so what was at the core of this? And so lots of, debates about, well, was it the state institutions and so forth? And then out comes a book by David Kang, I think in 1995, in which he says, this South Korean economic miracle was built on the back of cronyism, that there was, a lot of crony economic relations between the state and business, and yet you still saw 10% growth rates, right? So that raises, this is not to say that, I am in favor of cronyism on a moral normative perspective, but it raises an interesting empirical question of under what conditions do you see this kind of privileged access to economic opportunities conducive to growth, or at least not standing in the way of growth, and under what conditions does it seem to have negative effects, as a lot of these papers suggest to us. And here you see, I don't pretend to have the answer on this, but here you see a lot of interesting contrasts. Part, I think it's the economic moment in which these countries, I don't think we can ignore world historical time. And this relates to some of the earlier points that I made about the conditions of the global economy being more propitious for an export-led development kind of strategy in the 60s and 70s when these countries started to take off. Also the Cold War context and the role of the United States and so forth in, receiving exports and so forth. But also there's clearly a lot of work on the nature of state-business relations in these countries that suggests that despite the presence of networks of privilege, as Steve Heidemann would put it, in, say, South Korea, you saw that government decision makers were incentivizing firms to invest in globally competitive industries, which of course sets up a different context than when you're investing in domestically protected industries, and also were seemed to be rewarding behavior that was based on output and economic success and productivity. So there seems to be a different sort of relationship between state actors and business actors, despite the presence of crony networks in which policymakers were rewarding performance, were rewarding economic performance. And part of this, I think, is the requirements of having to compete in the global economy and so forth. So this invites, I think, some really interesting questions about the politics of privileges and under what conditions can they actually be harnessed in a way that can drive more productive economic outcomes, and so forth. So it really invites us to look at the nature of those deals more closely that operate between the state and business, and to problematize what's exactly going on in those deals. And some recent work by Hallward and Dreimeyer and Pritchett shows that there's, in fact, that deals are really at the center of what's going on in private sector development in middle-income countries, in developing countries. And they've done some interesting work where they look at these doing business databases by the World Bank that say, it takes X number of days to get a contract or whatever, whatever measure indicator you're looking at. And then they were involved in running a number of enterprise surveys that ask firm owners exactly how many days did it take you to get that contract and so forth. And they find this very interesting mismatch between what's on the doing business database and what's in the enterprise survey. And the answer to what explains that gap is that there's informal deals going on that are, really what's driving the way that state-business relations occur, and not what's on the paper, on the formal rules of how you get a contract or how you acquire land or whatever it might be. So there's clearly a lot more going on that needs to be investigated in terms of how privileged access actually gets translated into investment, and under what conditions does that lead to negative outcomes for growth, for productivity, for employment creation, and all of these things that are so critical to long-term sustainable development, and under what conditions does that lead to more productive outcomes in which you have more of a win-win scenario. Now, I don't mean to idealize the East Asian experience. Scholars of labor politics pointed out that actually these kinds of arrangements were quite repressive to labor, and labor movements were quite central to subsequent democratization mobilization in the East Asian cases, among other actors. But clearly there's something qualitatively different going on when you have cronyism that leads to, or that does not stand in the way of 10% growth rates, and when you have cronyism that has been documented so nicely by many of these papers to have a quite different set of outcomes. So I'm really excited to hear more about the results of these investigations, and I'm delighted that this research program is advancing in such productive ways. So thank you.